if I think of my role as a news brand to provide different viewpoints and not all written by me or my newsroom, I think we become more valuable than try to say we will only give you what we produce.
Raju, why has the media been such laggards?
I think it stems from success. It stems from being monopolies. It stems from thinking that the barriers to entry of new competition would be very similar to how it were when we were in the print world. But what we fundamentally miscalculated was digital would make the cost of entry of new players much lower. There would be the platforms, there would be technologies that would come and take people away from us. And I don't think we saw any of that.
Do you think the legacy publishers, and by that I mean, the mid-size ones, are still playing catch-up?
Those that can afford to play catch-up are playing catch-up, but most of them are, I think, not able to catch up anymore, right? I mean, take the US, for example. For a country of 300 million people, we now have only 9 newspapers with more than 100,000 circulation. So the idea that you had like a monopoly, you had a big audience that you could somehow convert them to digital, I think that's pretty much gone away. There's a bit of a strength in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post end of that legacy players, but everybody else is kind of really struggling. So I think it's a bit too late to think that you would go back to the glory days. And so in that sense, I have a feeling that the opportunity is behind them.
And yet, while on one hand, you think that print journalism is on the decline, you think journalism more generally has a really promising future, don't you?
It's only last couple of years that half of the world has been able to access the internet on a daily basis. And which means that there are probably another 2 to 3 billion people who are going to be able to come onto the internet on a daily basis over the next, let's say, 5, 10, 15 years. And a big chunk of them will look for news. A lot of them will look for entertainment and sports and other things as well. And as a result, I think the demand for what we produce out of newsrooms is going to be still very, very strong for a very long time to come. And if you look at Facebook, if you look at all of the big tech platforms, whether it's YouTube, whether it's Twitter, Snap, they're actually amazing platforms for virality, for sharing, but none of them actually create original content.
So just on that, do you think Facebook should dump journalism off its platform?
I think the issues are more complicated, right? In the sense that in a lot of countries, between regulation, between newsrooms demanding payments, the question of how they should pay for content has become a real issue. But if you look at it from an audience point of view, it's very hard to imagine these big platforms would want to stay away from news, because that's what attracts a lot of people to congregate and share. So it's going to be a challenge for these platforms to say that we will walk away from news. I think what they're talking about is whether they should be paying for it. And I think a lot of countries are passing, Australia in particular, are passing laws and passing regulations to force that issue.
So your message to a person entering journalism now would be to take their digital pad and head off and find stories and then find platforms, because the future is promising. But on the other hand, if you're a legacy print publisher, you've got to really look at ways of starting again.
First of all, the number of customers for legacy print products is declining. They're getting older and they have more choices. It's not all bad news, by the way, given the kind of the demographics of a lot of countries. People are living longer, they have more money to spend. As a result, they are valuable audiences. So there is some value to that. But the younger, newer audiences are not coming to print in any meaningful way, if at all. I have 2 teenage girls who have grown up in a house with both their parents being journalists or ex-journalists. and they barely spend any time looking at conventional media. So I think those issues are forcing big brands to think very differently about how do we bring younger audiences to them.
My understanding is that younger audiences will read just as much, but they read differently and across many platforms instead of one. And so that creates a real problem for the legacy publishers.
I think the bigger threat is that a lot of young people are not paying attention to the source of information. So again, using my daughters, I often ask, where do you read it? And their usual response is, I don't know. And I kind of say, well, it makes a big difference whether you read something from the Daily Mail or whether you read something from the Washington Post. And I think somewhere along the way, our industry did a disservice when we stopped investing in media literacy, when we stopped doing classroom editions, because those didn't seem like they were going to give us a lot of return right away. And I think we have created a couple of generations of kids or readers who don't necessarily see the connection between good journalism, a brand, and how it comes to them. And I think we have to reestablish that trust. Otherwise, those who can do clickbait better than us will tend to draw away and siphon off audiences.
So what then do you think journalism will look like in 2035, given if we continue with the current trend and we don't try and bend people's behavior?
I think it'll be, from a consumer point of view, I think it's actually not a bad place to be, in the sense that we will have a lot more choices. I think our reading habits will be much more diffused. We might, for example, in the morning, we might be getting a few newsletters that we trust from people and their curation. I think the biggest role that conventional media can play is, instead of thinking ourselves as gatekeepers, where we decided what to tell you on the front page tomorrow, what 5 stories will be there. I think we have to say that our role becomes more gate openers rather than gatekeepers, in the sense that people trust us to help them navigate this world of information. And if we can provide like the right cues or the right pathways, some of them could be our own content, but to say, look, if you're interested in small business, here are a couple of stories that we did out of our newsroom. Here are 3 or 4 other stories that we found that were interesting and of good quality. I think that's what brings readers back to a brand these days, not just our own content.
The other aspect of this, of course, is polarization, and it's extreme in the United States, but it's still apparent in Australia too, that the ongoing war between the Australian and the ABC seems to be self-destructive to both. How do you stop that? How do you finish the polarization?
I think that our approach to objectivity, where we try to act like we have no views of our own, or we hid those, and we would just expect people to believe that we don't have a point of view, I think has caused us a bit of disservice. I am of the opinion that being more transparent about where we are, what we are, and labeling it, I think is a better way for people to say, look, Raju might have a point of view, and he's kind of disclosing that, but based on what he's writing, I can choose to believe him or not, rather than say that, I have no point of view. And I think some of that labeling could get a bit sharper. The distinctions between the op-ed, the edit, and the news pages, which were very distinct in a print environment, are totally garbled, right? If we see a link on Twitter, we don't really know that it's an opinion piece or a news piece till we actually go to that news organization and look at it. So I think there are lots of ways to think about it. And technology, I know we think of technology as causing a lot of problems, but we have been working with the MIT Media Labs on using AI. And I'll give you a simple example. There have been studies that show that you can predict media habits from looking at the choice of words and phrases that a person chooses to engage with. So if you can say as a reporter, some people seem to kind of gravitate towards certain words, And by using those words or not using those words, I'm able to expand my audience and bring more people into conversations and into reading what I'm saying. I think you can use technology also to kind of help reduce polarization. Then I think we are trying to do in a very journalistic way, right? I think how do we get? I don't think the problem is that there is a Fox and there's an MSNBC or there's a CNN, which is supposed to be in the middle of things. The challenge is to get people to say that how do we consume multiple formats and multiple brands? And that challenge, I think, still remains to be addressed.
What do you mean? How do we consume multiple formats? I didn't quite.
I think we tend to look at it in a very binary way, saying that you are either a Fox person or an MSNBC person. Right? The question is, can we figure out ways? Can we use technology? Can we use curation and aggregation to get somebody to say, here's a Fox story, here's an MSNBC story, here is a CNN story on the same topic. And I think there are ways to kind of do that curation, which goes back to my earlier point. If I think of my role as a news brand to provide different viewpoints and not all written by me or my newsroom, I think we become more valuable than try to say we will only give you what we produce.
What you say is dead right. So the publishers are very quickly to call out the political bias of their neighbour, but they're very protective of their own, they're very defensive about their supposed objectivity themselves.
One of the things that technology has brought, including social platforms, is the ability for individuals to relate to writers and columnists and others in a newsroom well beyond the brand, right? So as a result, I think we should think about again, if Washington Post is the brand, there could be several people at the Washington Post who are also sub-brands. I think rather than trying to subsume everything under the Washington Post brand and people have impressions about that one brand, I think if we can take advantage of social media and digital to say that within the Washington Post brand, which may be middle of the road or slightly left of center or whichever way they want to position it, we also have individuals whose points of view, whose perspectives, whose biases are actually known. And then you can choose to consume what they're saying. I think that may be a better collective approach to building trust back rather than trying to kind of say that, come to us for everything and don't go to somewhere else for anything else.
So Raju, are you an optimist or a pessimist about what journalism is going to be doing in 2035 and beyond?
So I am neither in the camp of the glass is half full and the glass is half empty. I'm in the camp that the glass is always refillable. So I guess that makes me an optimist because, again, I see the tremendous opportunity to reach more people in the world, how technology has enabled us. So take any news brand, Peter. For example, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, at the peak of our print circulation, if you thought that every single copy was being read every day, we were at 2.3 million copies. Today, the same brand in the US alone probably has about 40 million unique visitors to its website. So there've never been a larger audience. And you take any brand, whether it's financially in trouble or not, they've had a bigger audience. So to me, that's where my optimism stems from. Our ability to reach more people has never been better. And we will continue to reach way more people. And so in that sense, what we produce will have a long life. The question really becomes, are we adapting the right platforms? Are we figuring out sustainable business models? And all those challenges still remain.
So are you a supporter then of publicly funded news?
I'm a supporter of multiple ways to fund news organizations. In the US, for example, the nonprofit model seems to be really taking off. The philanthropic model seems to be taking off. Where I have a problem with is that shouldn't preclude these organizations from still trying to be sustainable. I think that's where there's a gap where, because there's an expectation that your operating costs will always be met by somebody, you're not even thinking about how do I create sources of revenue. You don't have to be for profit in that sense, but you should always try to be profitable, is my view, whether you are the BBC, whether you are ABC, or whether you are public broadcasting. There's no reason why we can't find opportunities to raise money and at least reduce the amount of dependency we are having on public funding.
Raju, greatly appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.